Well, if you're watching this video, you have a time machine and you are going to go back to 2010 to be a web developer. It's an interesting choice, but to me, it was kind of a golden age of development, especially if you were just learning like I was. Took my first web design class in January or February 2010, and I thought it was great. I had so much fun, and so much of what we do today was just coming out in 2010, really 2010 to 2012, kind of a golden age for learning. So let me tell you everything that I remember. I did do some research just to make sure that my memory was correct. I wrote it all down. I'm going to share it with you so you are prepared. And I don't know, maybe you're going back because you want to see the transition from HTML4 to HTML5. You want to see what it was like to implement CSS3 in Internet Explorer 7. Yeah, the summer of 2010, there was this new term called responsive web design that we were all trying to figure out. And mobile first, it did exist, but nobody knew what it meant. We were all brand new to this. I think it's fair to say that 2010 was a lot different than 2025. By the way, I'm looking at my notes, so if I'm looking down, that's what I'm doing. I just want to tell you what you can expect, the types of resources that were available, and if you decide to stay, what you can look forward to in 2011 and everything moving forward. So with that being said, I am going to try to be as comprehensive as I can be. I mean, some things are just going to be beyond the scope of this video. I'm going to touch on the things that I remember and that I think are most important. Like I said, I lived through this period, so a lot of what I'm telling you is based on my own memory. So let's start with what people are going to call you. What is your job title? There's only a couple of choices. There's web developer, which I would say is kind of like the equivalent of a full stack developer. There's web designer, but that strongly implies that you have probably more design skills than you actually do. I think this is the modern equivalent of front-end developer. That term was not being widely used for several more years. I didn't hear the term front-end developer until at least 2012, possibly 2013. Definitely not a job title in 2010, or at least not that I'm aware of. And then there's the most absurd job title of all, webmaster or webmistress. That didn't age very well. I don't think that for a group of people that is so wildly insecure with imposter syndrome, I think it's crazy that we had a title like webmaster. Now, I didn't hear the term software engineer until at least 2015 or 2016, and I do remember thinking that software engineer sounded like an 80s or 90s programmer, somebody very formal, computer science, embedded systems. Now it's pretty much a default title for anybody who is coding professionally, and rightly so. I think it's a title that accurately describes what developers are doing today. It's incredibly complex. But yeah, just not really a thing, not really a common job title for your average web developer back in 2010. So I think you can pretty much expect to be called either a web designer or a web developer. Let's get into kind of like the basics, starting with HTML. The first draft of HTML5 was released in 2008. It was not really considered stable until 2014. Browsers were very slowly starting to implement it or adapt HTML5 standards. Really, what you're going to be using in 2010 is either HTML 4.01 or XHTML. Now, I can't go into all of the detail or nuance around HTML4 or XHTML, but I am going to give you just a taste of what you can expect, which really starts with the doc type. Both HTML4 and XHTML had strict transitional and frame set, and then XHTML had a doc type of 1.1. So you have 7 to choose from, and you will spend hours of your life agonizing over which one is the best one. So you will want to do a little bit of additional research on XHTML or HTML4. You will slowly be able to start implementing HTML5 into your builds more towards the end of 2010. I would say that really doesn't start to ramp up though till at least 2011, 2012. Table-based layouts, yes, they are still being taught. When I took my first web design class in 2010, it was January or February 2010, we were specifically taught table-based layouts. Tables aren't your only option. You will be able to use something called floats. We're going to get more into that when we get to the CSS. This is where div soup, the term div soup, became popular. There were lots of divs, so many divs. Semantic, calling your markup semantic was not really a thing. We did have like the strong tag or the emphasis tag. We didn't have sections, articles, none of that. It was all divs and spans. Accessibility. Now, it's nice to know that accessibility, WCAG web accessibility standards have existed since 1999, and there definitely were people talking about web accessibility. Chris Coyer at CSS Tricks talked a lot about web accessibility, but it's really not a best practice to be accessible. Now, I'm not celebrating this at all, but if you struggle with accessibility today, you have nothing to worry about in 2010. It is just not being talked about hardly at all. Certainly, there's no expectation that you're implementing web accessibility standards. So, and you're going to have your hands full with HTML4, XHTML4, and CSS floats. Now, in 2010, the book HTML5 for Web Designers by Jeremy Keith was released. It was published by A Book Apart. This is another thing that you're going to want to keep your eyes open for. There's a website called A List Apart. Everybody reads A List Apart. It's not really a website with like tutorials or how-tos. It's maybe a little more philosophical. It talks about the state of web design, the future of web design, where we are, where we're headed, but it's excellent reading. Now, in 2024, they stopped publishing new books and new articles. I mean, I feel like though they do still publish the occasional article, but these books were available as physical copies or digital copies. I always meant to get the physical copy, but I never did. I have many of their digital copies, which were just like PDFs or Kindle version, but they are excellent. And HTML5 for Web Designers in 2010 was such a great resource if you wanted to understand HTML5 and what it was capable of. Get your hands at the very least on a digital copy, but if you can get your hands on the physical copy, those are a keeper. Sadly, like I said, they're going to stop publishing new books in 2024. But if you're learning about HTML for the first time, this is hands down one of the best resources. Now, in 2011, oh, this is so exciting. You are going to want to pick up the first edition of Murach's HTML and CSS. Now, I have the 2012 edition, which is not the second edition. This is a reprint of the first edition that included HTML5 and CSS3, not an official second edition. That didn't come out until 2015. So if you can hold out till 2012 to get the reprint, I would actually recommend that. But if you really need resources and you need help, pick up that 2011 copy as soon as it comes out. Until then, anything by A List Apart, anything on CSS Tricks, anything on Smashing Magazine is really going to help you out. They're going to be great resources for you, especially when it comes to HTML and CSS. Speaking of which, let's dive into CSS. There's no Flexbox, there's no CSS grid. We are starting to move away from table-based layouts, but they're still acceptable. If you're building a website with a table-based layout, it's still okay to do it in 2010. Probably, though, you are going to want to start understanding floats and clearing your floats. Now, again, I can't go into too much detail about what happens to a div when you clear your float, but I want you to practice. Well, you're going to be forced into it once you get there, but if you can practice ahead of time, you will be all the better. Flexbox technically was introduced in 2009, but it was rewritten in 2010 and 11, did not get widespread browser support until 2013. CSS Grid, yeah, no, that isn't really supported until 2017. Now, also in 2010, you will want to pick up a copy of A Book Apart's CSS3 for Web Designers by Dan Cederholm. This is an excellent introduction to CSS3 and what you can expect, but if you're going to start implementing CSS3 in 2010, you are going to need vendor prefixes. All of them. There are 4. There's WebKit, Mozilla, Microsoft, and Opera. So for every CSS3 property you write, you will actually write it 5 times and hope that it actually works in each of the browsers. Now, on May 25th, 2010, Ethan Marcotte is going to write an article for a list apart called Responsive Web Design, and it will be considered famous in the community. Check out that article if you are struggling right now with responsive web design, because I don't know where you're at in your journey. All I know is that you're going back to 2010 to be a web developer. If you're struggling with responsive design, definitely check out that article. Now, in 2011, A Book Apart is going to publish responsive web design as a standalone book, but the article itself is excellent, and it really makes responsive web design a buzzword. Mobile first. This is actually a term that is starting to be used in 2010. We don't know what it means, so it exists, but we don't really understand what mobile first means. Now, mobile first responsive web design, what is it that even prompted those things to start happening? Well, in 2010, the iPhone 4 was released. Now, yes, a lot of people were getting smartphones, but a lot of people were also still clinging to their Blackberries. Android was on the scene, not nearly as popular though as the iPhone. This is where we got introduced to Retina displays, and it goes without saying, websites completely unusable on an iPhone. We needed to come up with ways using CSS3 media queries to make sure that websites were actually usable on mobile devices. You are also going to want to start learning about something called a CSS sprite. SVGs, they existed, of course, we weren't really using them yet. A CSS sprite is a gigantic PNG where you load up all of your icons, a full color version and a transparent or black and white version, and then you use background positioning to line them all up with pixel perfect precision, and then you have a little hover state for that black and white or transparent position. Be very careful, so when you add a new icon to your sprite, you're going to have to go back and readjust the positioning for all of your previous sprites. But it's only one HTTP request because resources are precious, and it's the only way really to load in individual icons and states without loading in individual images for every single icon. It was the best way to do it. Yeah, Twitter Bootstrap. No, not until 2011. Foundation, certainly no Tailwind. None of that existed. So you will have to write your own CSS. Make sure that you understand display properties. Please, for the love of God, make sure you know what display block is, display inline is, display inline block. Those things are going to be very important. And positioning. Entire websites, not small websites either, big enterprise level e-commerce websites are being built where the entire layout is position absolute. Make sure you understand which container is position relative, which container is position absolute, and how the z-index works. You can't put 9,999 on every container with position absolute. It just won't work. So make sure you understand how to do that. Now, SaaS, Syntactically Awesome Style Sheets, was first introduced in November of 2006, so it does exist. But again, SaaS is not a framework or a library. It's like a shorthand and a compiler. So it's a way to organize your CSS files, and certainly you'll have use of variables, but it's not like Bootstrap or Foundation or Tailwind today, where you can just add classes to markup and it does all the styling for you. You will still, even if you're using SaaS, you have to know how to write the CSS yourself. So how are you going to write CSS? Like, what are the resources for CSS? Well, in terms of like organization and organizing your style sheets, look out in 2011 for Jonathan Snook and SMAX. This is Scalable and Modular Architecture for CSS. It is a CSS methodology to help you stay organized and to just help you get it straight what is what. So he developed this system where you can organize your CSS into 5 categories: base, layout, module, state, and theme. And it's very popular. It's just a way to help you get organized. So even if you're not using SaaS, and I don't think there's any pressure to use SaaS by the way, at least look into SMAX so you have a way to organize your CSS in a way that isn't completely chaotic. Okay, so next, JavaScript. I hope that it's obvious that there is no React. That didn't come out until 2013. There is no Vue. That doesn't come out until 2014. Now, Angular was technically released at the end of 2010. Certainly, it was not mainstream for years to come. You are going to need to learn something called jQuery. jQuery and how to initialize jQuery in safe mode. So raw JavaScript at this time is kind of radioactive and not to be trusted. Certainly there's no let, there's no const, we only have var. Listen, there's no arrow functions, there's no fetch. You are going to need to brush up on your XML HTTP requests. DOM manipulation is like a slide toggle and an add class, but I have to tell you, even that was magical at the time. There are other frameworks like MooTools and Dojo, but really jQuery is universal. We used it all the time and we loved it. Node was released in 2009, but it was for Linux and Mac OS. It wasn't released for Windows until 2011, so that is something to look forward to. And even then, it's not really being widely used at all. Node apps just really aren't a thing at this time. We definitely need to talk about Internet Explorer. I mean, obviously, you're going to be using Firefox and Chrome, and you're going to love, even the early versions of those browsers were great, but you're still going to be expected to support Internet Explorer. IE7 was released in October of 2006. IE8 was released in March of 2009, and the beta version of IE9 was released in September 2010. The full release was 2011. Now, IE9 was the first version to support HTML5 natively, so that's when we finally had like header, footer, section, things like that. And the internet and browsers were slowly starting to mature. Yeah, but IE7 was not among them. IE7 and 8 in particular are going to give you a lot of trouble because this is an era where people are extremely distrustful of a Windows upgrade, and they will continue to use old versions of Internet Explorer for decades. So you're out there on the cutting edge with Chrome and Firefox, you will still have to support legacy versions of Internet Explorer. And listen, this is going to be tough on your mental health because you're obviously ahead of your time. You're using an Eric Meyer CSS browser reset. Maybe you've begun implementing CSS3 transitions. Maybe you even understand floats and how to clear your floats. But most of it isn't going to work in Internet Explorer, and it's really beyond the scope of this video to go into all the ways that you're going to have to hack your code to get to work in Internet Explorer. So you're going to have to do a little research there. Now, we do have polyfills. Polyfills are JavaScript that help the browser understand HTML5 and CSS3. There's something called the HTML5 Shiv or Shim by Remy Sharp that came out in 2009, and it was developed to help older versions of Internet Explorer recognize new HTML5 elements. They will have to be added to the head with conditional statements. This is something that Microsoft did give us. This was their way of detecting if the browser was Internet Explorer and its version. So you could detect if the user was on a browser later than IE9, which was pretty handy. You're also going to need to use things like Respond.js for CSS3 media queries, Selectivizer to let IE understand selectors like nth child, and Modernizer for feature detection. That was a good one, Modernizer. I use that a lot. So next, let's talk about software. This is actually one of the best parts of traveling back to 2010. Because software as a service really wasn't a thing then, not like it is now. So it's pretty exciting because you're going to buy your first copy of Adobe Creative Suite and they're going to mail you the CD-ROMs. You are going to own it. And it will have everything. It will have Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign. It's going to have something called Sound Booth for audio. I was a podcaster, so I really loved that. It's going to have Flash. You can build lots of things with Flash, banners, menus, entire home pages. And it has something called Fireworks, which is probably where you're going to build your CSS sprites. Fireworks was kind of like this light version of Illustrator. It was like graphic design for the web. It was really cool. I loved it. And The best part is you're going to have Dreamweaver. You're going to do all of your editing in Adobe Dreamweaver, all of your file editing. Because if you're on Windows, Sublime Text 1 was released in 2008, but it's not going to be available for Mac or Linux until 2012. So if you're on a Mac, yeah, you're definitely going to be using Dreamweaver. So as soon as you get there, make sure you have a mailing address and make sure you order your copy of Creative Suite. I think in 2010 it was CS4, and I think in 2011 it was CS5. I could be fuzzy on that. I had both. I ordered CS4, I think, at the end of 2009. And when did I get CS5? I honestly don't remember, and I didn't check that. But like I said, I had both. And just make sure that you write down your license key and put it someplace safe. Yeah, you don't want to hang on to that. So now, if you have any kind of interest in design, layout, things like that, you could also sign up for something called Before and After magazine. So Before and After was basically a layout, and was it a graphic, would you consider it graphic design? It was layout, typography, color, spacing, things like that. So if you were more on the design side of things, because there was no UI UX designer at that time, you would probably want to get yourself a copy of Before and After. Now this has 50 issues in PDF starting in the 90s when they first started publishing. And the guy who runs Before and After, he was like an early adopter of the very first version of Photoshop. And this is an excellent CD-ROM. I obviously have all the copies today. You'll learn a lot about typography, color, layout, white space, all of those things. So you're going to want to pick up yourself one of these. And then where do you find help? Where do you find help as a developer? Where do you find new information? Where do you ask questions? Well, you're right to assume that there's no AI and there's no ChatGPT, and instead you're going to want to start using Stack Overflow. Now, Stack Overflow was launched in 2008, but it's definitely still kind of ramping up in 2010. I would say in 2011, 2012, it completely dominates, but be very careful when you're on Stack Overflow because there are lots of rules and etiquette for how you post. And if you don't follow those rules, you will be chastised. You may never get the help that you need. So what are the rules? Number one, do your homework. Do your homework or be prepared to be roasted with what have you tried? Number two, formatting is absolutely sacred. If your code isn't properly indented, you might get downvoted out of pure spite. So, duplicate police. Don't post duplicate questions. Hunting duplicates and closing them was literally rewarded with reputation points. And there were veterans on Stack Overflow that was all they did was look for duplicates and close them. There's zero tolerance for vague questions. You don't want to get flagged as not being constructive. And number 5, mark your answers as accepted so others can benefit. It had a hall monitor vibe for sure. I think Stack Overflow wants to make sure that the community is constantly policing itself and maintaining a standard. The problem, though, is that new developers often were too scared to post. But for the people who did post, there, I think, are some legendary questions and answers on Stack Overflow. So definitely look there if you need help. Search results. Now, if you're Googling looking for help, be extremely mindful of results that come from a URL called W3 Schools. It looks official, but it is not part of the W3C, which is the World Wide Web Consortium. In fact, at one point, the W3C even put a message on their website saying that they were not affiliated. And here's the problem. That site launched in 1998, and it had really good SEO. It was ranking at the top of nearly any result related to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but often the tutorials were incomplete or just plain wrong. New devs were getting a lot of bad information from that site. And here's the thing, we didn't know who owned it. We didn't know who maintained it. It would be years before we found out that it was owned by a Norwegian company who did eventually clean it up and update some of their tutorials. And I don't think that today it's a bad website at all. I've gotten some of my questions answered on W3 Schools, but at the time it was kind of radioactive. You didn't want to touch it. You didn't want to go near it because you didn't know if the information was right. So just be really careful. I think that CSS Tricks was an awesome resource. Chris Coyer was doing an excellent job writing about CSS and just web development in general. So that's a great place to look. And then, of course, there was also Smashing Magazine. They had excellent articles. I think Smashing Magazine launched in 2009. They're a German website, German organization, and they had awesome tutorials. So Stack Overflow, Googling, CSS Tricks, A List Apart for sure, and Smashing Magazine, all really excellent resources. And then any books that you can get your hands on, especially Marock's HTML and CSS, fantastic resource, just excellent. So what's next here? Well, let's talk about content management systems, because this was really what full stack development kind of meant in 2010. So if you want to be a full stack developer, you're probably going to choose either WordPress, Joomla, or Drupal. Now, Drupal was definitely a player, but I think it was considered more enterprise. Joomla was very popular with agencies and had a pretty big presence in template marketplaces like ThemeForest, but WordPress was like the big thing. WordPress has been out since 2004. In 2010, they had just released version 3, and that came with custom post types, which was very exciting. And the WordPress codex, if you were a WordPress developer, was chef's kiss. It was so good. It was so well written. It could feel a little chaotic at times, but it was open source and had a lot of contributors. I started my career as a developer doing WordPress and building WordPress themes, and I just remember the codex being so, so good. So if you have an interest in doing WordPress, the documentation is excellent. It is so widely used that there are a lot of people developing for it, and you shouldn't have any trouble finding help. That was my experience, and I think that you could expect that as well. Let's talk about GitHub, because we were just starting to talk about workflows and version control and how do we keep track of our work and document our work. GitHub launched in 2008. I would say that in 2010 it was definitely growing, but it wasn't standard. Small teams are probably using SVN or Subversion. Now, in 2011, 2012, GitHub totally exploded. This is when workflows were like mainstream. We had public repos, open source work. You could fork a project if it looked interesting. And of course, you could contribute with the pull request, which was super exciting. I personally created my GitHub in 2013, and by then it was totally starting to feel mainstream. But how did we deploy? Probably you were still using FTP. That was the main way that I deployed. Of course, I was also on Windows back then. Version control just wasn't really standard in 2010, and a lot of people were using FileZilla. That's what I remember. That's what I used. SSH, also not standard, especially on shared hosting, which is where a lot of us got our start on shared hosting. In fact, SSH was usually disabled on shared hosting. You were most likely logging in with FTP, maybe SFTP, and you were just logging in with root and a password and then dragging and dropping your files to deploy. That was it. In 2014 and 2015, GitHub are going to start to normalize SSH usage. My best advice is sign up for GitHub right away. Use Git locally as much as possible, push as much as possible, because when you deploy with FTP at some point, maybe once, maybe twice, maybe a few handful of times, you are going to overwrite something that you didn't mean to on the server with FTP. And if you're not at least using Git locally, you're going to be screwed. Ask me how I know. So just get into the habit of using Git and you'll be fine. So So more resources. We talked about CSS tricks. We talked about a list apart, Smashing Magazine, Before and After Magazine. In 2011, Chris Coyer and Jeff Starr are going to write a book called Digging into WordPress, also an excellent resource, really, really good information. There's something called Code Drops. Now, they started in 2009, and that was more on the design thing, on the design side, especially with CSS3. I would personally wait every single week to see what the next Code Drops article was. They made all of their code open source. You could copy it, use it for anything. It was super exciting. I loved it. So keep an eye out for Code Drops. And then if you're looking for more like formal tutorial or courses, check out lynda.com. Now today, lynda.com is actually LinkedIn Learning. They were acquired, I don't even know how long ago. It was a while ago. But at the time, it was lynda.com, and they really did have good tutorials. But I would say that tutorials, courses, not the norm, not normal. Certainly no boot camps. I don't know of any boot camps that were happening back in 2010. And we were still buying books back then. We loved the A Book Apart books. We loved the Smashing Magazine books that started coming out in 2011. The books ruled. Everybody had the books. We loved the books. YouTube and tutorials. Yeah, definitely not what it is today. If you were lucky enough to find a tutorial on YouTube that answered your question, it could have a 1 to 2 minute intro with music. More likely than not, you're just going to find some guy recording his stream, talking about jQuery variables, not giving you really any context, not even finishing his thought. Certainly the title was almost never indicative of what the video actually was. It was not a good place to be. So if you were able to find a good tutorial or get your questions answered on YouTube in 2010, it was actually pretty rare. So we should probably talk about what it was like to get a job back in 2010. Now, I didn't get my first job as a developer until 2014, but I think a lot of what I experienced in 2014 still applied. I think from 2010 to about 2014, 2015, it was actually pretty easy to get a job as a developer. I remember my first tech interview. Well, I'm sure he asked me more questions. The only 2 questions I remember is, what does CSS stand for and what is Z-index? That's it. That's all I remember. And I was able to answer both of those questions. So I think that's why I got the job. I also had to spend half a day in their office building a WordPress theme from scratch. And I don't think I would do that again today. Luckily, I got the job and I was able to finish building the theme after I got hired. But in hindsight, I do realize that I built half a theme for him for free. So there's that. Now, at my second dev job in 2015, there was no technical interview. I just went into their offices and we just did like a normal, totally garden variety interview. They didn't ask me a single technical question at all, and I didn't even think twice about it. Like that was not unusual to me at all, because I didn't even know that tech interviews were a thing. So my third dev job towards the end of 2015 did have a technical portion of the interview, but it was like a quiz from high school, because they just sat me in a room with a pencil and a sheet of paper that had questions on it, and I just wrote down my answers. I also remember the lead developer, or like the manager, asking me if I knew how to code parallax scrolling, because that was all the rage at the time. I said that I did, even though I didn't, and she never checked, and I still got that job. So Lead Code isn't launched until August 2015. So the intense tech job interviews that we're experiencing today, that really doesn't exist back then. I honestly think if you can center a div, you can get a job as a developer. So you're going to have a much easier time getting a job then than you are today. So I think that's about it. I tried to make this, like I said, as comprehensive as possible. I dug through, I spent a lot of time researching just based on my own memory of what it was like. And I found out that my memory was actually pretty accurate. I hope that this was helpful for you. If you decide to stay, stick around, because I would say 2010 to 2012 is a pretty exciting time, especially for the amount of experience that you can get working as a developer and just seeing how development changes over the last 15 years. I think you're really going to love it.